believe the Grail actually exists.
The search for the cup of Christ is the search for the divine in all of us. But if you want facts, Indy, I've none to give you. At my age, I'm prepared to take a few things on faith.
We're about to complete a great quest that began almost 2,000 years ago. The Holy Grail, Dr. Jones. The chalice used by Christ during the Last Supper. The cup that caught his blood at the crucifixion and was entrusted to Joseph of Arimathea.
The Arthur legend. I've heard this bedtime story before.
This is the manuscript in which the friar chronicled the knight's story. It doesn't reveal the location of the Grail, I'm afraid, but the knight promised that 2 markers that had been left behind would. This tablet is one of those markers. It proves the knight's story is true. Our project leader has vanished, along with all his research. I want you to pick up the trail where he left off. Find the man, and you will find the Grail.
Why don't you try my father?
We already have. Your father is the man who's disappeared.
You have your father's eyes.
And my mother's ears. And the rest belongs to you. I'll be right back.
Junior?
Don't call me that, please.
Half the German army's on our tail, and you want me to go to Berlin? Into the lion's den?
The quest for the Grail is not archaeology. It's a race against evil. If it is captured by the Nazis, the armies of darkness will march all over the face of the earth.
Germany has declared war on the Jones boys.
You think we're trying to kill them? I know that! It happens to me all the time. Where's my father?
They have them in the belly of that steel beast.
Dad! Dad! Junior! Henry Jones Jr.
I like Indiana.
We're named the dog Indiana.
You are named after the dog?
On 24th of May 1989, Indiana Jones returned to the big screen in The Last Crusade. Arriving first in the USA, it made its way across to the UK in June, and throughout the rest of the year worldwide. With Raiders of the Lost Ark costing just under $20 million, The Last Crusade clocked in at nearly $50 million. With Indiana Jones already proving a huge success twice with audiences, the, at the time, final entry in the series followed suit and made $474 million worldwide. The film was met with rave reviews from critics and fans alike, despite comparisons being made to Raiders of the Lost Ark, with returning characters and similar plot beats. 1989 was a year of sequels and new franchises. Tim Burton's Batman pretty much dominated the box office. Although Batman was the most popular film in the USA that year, worldwide The Last Crusade took the crown as the most successful film, earning $60 million more at the box office. Factor in Batman's heavy sales in merchandise though, and it was the most profitable property of that year. It seemed after the failed toy range based on Raiders, toy manufacturers gave up on optioning merchandise on the film series. There were of course whips, hats and jackets available so you could dress up like Indy, but toys were very much a thing of the past for this franchise. Luckily, plenty of video games were available based on The Last Crusade, which will be discussed later. For The Last Crusade's video release, which came with Diet Coke promotions, director Steven Spielberg had campaigned to get his film released in widescreen on VHS, as he hated how his films were pan and scanned to fit the TV aspect ratio. This was also highlighted by Siskel and Ebert in 1990, but Paramount would not budge, as many people didn't like having black borders at the top and bottom of the picture, so Steven had to settle for having his film available in widescreen on Laserdisc, which was always the preferred format to watch movies as originally intended. 1984's The Temple of Doom, despite being popular at the box office, wasn't the film many had wanted. Its dark nature and change of tone had resulted in some lukewarm reviews. Lucas and Spielberg really wanted to rectify that and return to the spirit of Raiders, and for Indy's final adventure they wanted to go out with a bang. Lucas had initially suggested the idea of having the third movie be set in a haunted mansion, encountering a ghost who reveals the Fountain of Youth in Africa. Spielberg wasn't keen on this idea because it bore similarities to his 1982 film Poltergeist. Lucas went ahead anyway and completed an 8-page treatment titled Indiana Jones and the Monkey King. The story saw Indiana encountering a ghost in Scotland before finding the Fountain of Youth in Africa and going up against tribal cannibals. Spielberg had produced a number of successful films throughout the 80s and brought on Chris Columbus, who had written Gremlins, The Goonies and Young Sherlock Holmes. He would expand on George's treatment, introduce a bunch of new characters to join Indiana on his quest, and bring back the Nazis for him to battle. Columbus further refined his script while the production team started scouting for locations in Africa. But everything was halted due to Spielberg and Lucas having reservations because of its possible negative depiction of African natives, and because they felt the script was too unrealistic. It was moving into the realms of fantasy and further away from grounded reality of the character. Spielberg suggested the idea of introducing Indiana Jones' father, Henry Jones Sr., as the main focus of the plot, but Lucas was dubious, believing the Fountain of Youth should be the main direction. Spielberg convinced him in the end that the father-son relationship would serve as a great metaphorical backdrop to Indiana's search for the artifact. Spielberg wanted to develop his ideas and brought on the writer of his 1985 film The Colour Purple. Instead of the Fountain of Youth, the quest became the hunt for the Holy Grail. Spielberg was a bit worried with the idea of the Holy Grail as he didn't want people to think of Monty Python. He depicted Indiana searching for his father in the south of France, where he meets a nun and a relationship develops. Indiana travels to Venice, takes the Orient Express to Istanbul, and continues by train to Petra, where he meets Sala and reunites with his father. Then together they find the Grail. A lot of this material would end up in the final draft in some form or another. The ending in this script was a lot different to what was finally in the movie. At the climax, a Nazi villain touches the Grail and explodes. When Henry touches it, he ascends a stairway to heaven. The ending was dropped and later changed to a battle with a demon at the Grail site, where he defeats it with a dagger inscribed with "God is King." A prologue was introduced to the movie where we are shown Indy at a younger age. Spielberg suggested making Indiana a Boy Scout, as both he and Harrison Ford were former Scouts. This sequence would set up a number of moments that demonstrate how he became the man we know today. Spielberg felt that the script needed further revisions and suggested Inner Space writer Jeffrey Boehm. Jeffrey spent 2 weeks reworking the story with Lucas, which yielded a treatment that is largely the final film. Jeffrey told George that Indiana should find his father in the middle of the story. As the previous films ended with Indiana obtaining the objects, they didn't want to follow a similar pattern. Jeffrey felt it would be best for them to lose the Grail and let the father and son relationship be the main point. It was a search for Indy's own identity and coming to accept his father than being a quest for the Grail, which is the direction Steven Spielberg really wanted to go. For the cast, we have many returning characters. Of course, Harrison Ford is back as Indiana Jones. He was very happy with the direction of the story. He loved the idea of introducing Indy's father, because it allowed him to explore another side to Indiana's personality. The late River Phoenix was cast as Indy during his teenage years. Phoenix had played the son of Ford's character in The Mosquito Coast. Ford recommended Phoenix for the part. He said that of the young actors working at the time, Phoenix looked the most like him when he was around that age. Also, Phoenix does a really good job of capturing Ford's mannerisms. Owing to the positive reaction to the movie's prologue, George Lucas was inspired to develop the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles TV show, which lasted for 3 seasons, running from 1992 to 93. Sean Connery was cast as Indy's father, Professor Henry Jones, a professor of medieval literature, who cared more about looking for the Grail than raising his own son. Spielberg had always had Connery in mind when he suggested introducing Indiana's father. Spielberg had been a fan of Connery's work as James Bond and felt that he was the perfect choice. Spielberg always wanted to direct a James Bond film, and the Indiana Jones movies were his window into that, and having James Bond play Indy's father was ideal. Connery initially turned the role down as he is only 12 years older than Ford, but he was eventually persuaded. Connery, as a student of history, began to reshape the character, and revisions were made to the script to address his concerns. He improvised a line, "She talks in her sleep," which was left in because it made everyone laugh on set. Irish actor Alison Dooley plays Dr. Elsa Schneider, an Austrian art professor who is in league with the Nazis, but has her own desires on the Grail. She manages to seduce the Joneses in her attempts to gain more information on the Grail's location. Dooley started her career in modelling and got her first screen role in A View to a Kill. Before she appeared in The Last Crusade, she also starred alongside Pierce Brosnan in Taffin.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Denholm Elliott returns as Dr. Marcus Brody. Elliott returned after Spielberg sought to recapture the tone of Raiders, following the character's absence in Temple of Doom. Also, John Rhys Davies is back as Sala. Julian Glover was cast as Walter Donovan, an American businessman who sends the Joneses on their quest for the Holy Grail. Donovan secretly works for the Nazis and desires immortality. I'm sure Star Wars fans will recognise him from The Empire Strikes Back, where he played General Veers. Kevork Malakian plays Kazim, the leader of the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword, an organisation that protects the Holy Grail. Malakian had impressed Spielberg with his performance in Midnight Express. And last but not least, we have the late Robert Edison as the Grail Knight, the guardian of the Grail who drank from the cup of Christ during the Crusades, and is immortal as long as he stays within the temple. Edison was 80 years old at the time, and the majority of his career was spent on stage. He had worked in TV but had smaller roles in film. He was nervous but excited about taking the role, and often questioned his performance between takes, but he had nothing to worry about. Despite his small role, he left a lasting impression. Principal photography began on May 16, 1988, and the shoot lasted for around 63 days. With the increased budget, the number of shooting locations also grew, making use of Spain, Venice, Germany, Jordan, Utah, California, Texas, Colorado, and England, where most of the interior locations were created at Elstree Studios. Around this time, Spielberg was shocked to learn that Cannon Films was planning to sell the studio. Cannon was bleeding money and needed to cut their losses. The studio had been operating at a loss for a while. Stephen felt it was going to be a major blow to the UK film industry if the studio was lost to redevelopment. A large chunk of the studio was later sold and the lots were torn down and replaced with a Tesco supermarket. When Spielberg and editor Michael Kahn started working on a rough cut of the film in late 1988, they felt the movie suffered from a lack of action, so they included a motorcycle chase during post-production near Skywalker Ranch. To finish off the movie, Spielberg needed something extra to say goodbye to the series, so they went and shot Indiana, Henry, Salah and Brody riding off into the sunset in Texas in early 1989. The film is set 2 years after the events of Raiders. Indy has returned from another adventure and is swamped with school papers to grade. He can't handle the stress and escapes from his office. He is approached by a group of men who work for Walter Donovan. Walter is a collector of ancient artifacts and has an obsession with finding the Holy Grail, very much like Indy's father. Indy suggests he contact his father, but Walter informs him he has gone missing. He was already on the case looking for it for Donovan, using an incomplete inscription as his guide. Indy heads to his father's home and finds it trashed, as if someone was searching for something. He then remembers that he received a parcel which turns out to be his father's Grail diary mailed from Venice. Realising that he would not have sent the diary unless he was in trouble, Indy and Marcus travel to Venice, where they meet Henry's Austrian colleague, Dr. Elsa Schneider. Beneath the library where Henry was last seen, Indy and Elsa discover the tomb of the First Crusade Knight, which also contains a complete version of the inscription that Henry had used, revealing the location of the Grail. They flee when the catacombs are set aflame by the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword, a secret society that protects the location of the Grail to avoid it falling into the wrong hands. A boat chase ensues with Indy capturing Kazim. Indy tells Kazim that his goal is only to find his father and that he has no interest in finding the Grail. Kazim tells him that Henry is being held in Castle Bronwald. Marcus later reveals a map drawn by Henry of the route to the Grail, which begins in Alexandretta. Marcus heads out to rendezvous with their old friend Salah, and Indy and Elsa head to the castle. At Castle Bronwald, Indy locates his father, but learns that Elsa and Donovan are actually working with the Nazis. Meanwhile, Marcus is captured while waiting for Salah. The Joneses manage to escape from the castle. Henry tells Indy that to reach the Grail one must face 3 traps, and his diary contains the clues to guide them through the challenges safely. But they must head to Germany to retrieve the diary, as he doesn't remember the clues. They recover the diary from Elsa at a book-burning rally in Berlin, and then need to escape Germany to finally complete the quest for the Grail. 1989 was a busy year for George Lucas's visual effects company Industrial Light and Magic, working on many movies with large amounts of effects needed, such as Back to the Future Part 2, The Abyss, Leviathan, Ghostbusters 2 and of course The Last Crusade. As with all the indie films, Last Crusade made use of matte paintings, miniatures, blue screen optical work and even early digital compositing. The visual effects of the indie series to me were a little inconsistent and didn't showcase ILM's finest work. The movies had great isolated moments of matte paintings and miniatures, but the blue screen work was always very wobbly. The year this came out, ILM did incredible work on Back to the Future Part 2 and Ghostbusters 2, which both pushed the old school methods of visual effects to the limit, without computer generated material to tidy up the visuals. The Last Crusade though didn't have much in terms of large scale visual effects. The beauty of the Indiana Jones films is the approach to doing lots of the action in camera. The whole plane sequence with Indy and his father escaping the Nazis always looked bad, even when I saw it as a kid. Seeing it in HD didn't really do it many favours. it has the typical issue, the loss of colour when combining the elements. Spielberg is doing a lot of ambitious shots that blue screen can't really make look realistic. I'm surprised they didn't do any front projection work with it just to get rid of the black matte lines. The shots of the Zeppelin from a distance look really good, and the optical work stands up well. But you have this hilarious shot of the General shaking his fist in anger at Indy as the Zeppelin flies away. The whole shot seems flat and just doesn't work for me. But then you could argue the fact that it's a B-movie by design to homage the action serials of the past, and that the effects were never realistic and had very few visual effects to begin with. But I'm sure ILM didn't go in with that intention of making it look bad, but it's just their inherent problem with their over-reliance on blue screen to achieve everything. Now, there are some very effective shots in this movie that really demonstrated the creativity of the folks at ILM. Stop motion animation was used for the shot of the German fighter's wings breaking off as it crashes through the tunnel. The tunnel was a 210 feet model that occupied 14 of ILM's parking spaces for 2 months. It was built in 8-foot sections, and each section could be opened up to film through. When Indy and his father drive alongside the plane, it's all done in camera. It seamlessly blends with the miniature that careers down the tunnel, passes them, and eventually explodes. The hidden bridge is an inspired idea. When you see it in the film, it's like a magic eye trick. It seems invisible, and as the camera turns, it reveals the bridge. This was achieved with Ford being filmed in front of a blue screen for the scene, which was completed by a model of the bridge filmed against a matte painting. For the death of Donovan as he drinks from the wrong cup, Spielberg wanted him to grow old all in one shot, as his life is taken away very quickly. A shot of Donovan's death was created over 3 months by digitally compositing the footage, with help from the morphing software developed the year before on Willow to show the transitions. 3 puppets of Donovan were created in separate stages of decay, shooting them with time-lapse photography. A 4th puppet was used for the final decaying form, with Donovan's skeleton being hung on wires like a marionette. This whole sequence really impressed me as a kid, and for a PG-rated movie, it's pretty gruesome. Last Crusade was a nice way to end this series at the time. It combines old methods of visual effects throughout, but throws in a new technique that would come to dominate the visual effects of the 90s. John Williams returned to compose the score to The Last Crusade. This would be Spielberg and Williams' 9th collaboration. The score, as usual with Williams, is full of character and charm. It isn't the same music recycled from the previous films. He brings on new themes for the Nazis, Indy's father, and the Grail. Because of the added humour, there is a light touch to the score and musical cues that add a bit of playfulness to the music. It really complements the moments between Indy and his dad, and them trying to deal with the difficult situations they are put in. The film was less action orientated than the others, so the music has a change of direction. The film opens with this wonderful playful theme for the young Indiana. The music does a superb job of reacting to the action beats, with Indy avoiding all the obstacles in his way as he escapes from the grave robbers. The music itself is a little like the Battle of Endor from Return of the Jedi, and even moments of Hook that Williams composed 2 years later. The Raiders theme, which is essentially Indiana's main march, doesn't really pop up that much in the film and only really kicks in for the final shot as he rides off into the sunset while the end credits roll, but there are a couple of moments when Williams brings in the theme for when Indy does what he does best, and it's always glorious when you hear it. I've reviewed a number of films now that have scores by John Williams, and it's difficult to find more to say about him. He is the master and has given us so much wonderful music over the years. A film score is so important to a movie, and without Williams' genius, Indiana Jones, Star Wars, Superman, Harry Potter, Jurassic Park and E.T., to name but a few, just wouldn't be the same. The soundtrack arrived on CD and LP in 1989, with roughly an hour's worth of music. It certainly wasn't a complete release. It was later reissued in Japan with an extra minute or 2. But still not all of the music John had composed. In 2008, Concord Records published a box set with the music to all 4 Indy films, which I had discussed in my Raiders review. Last Crusade's score totaled about 76 minutes, so an extra 20 minutes of music was made available. This box set has been out of print for a long time, and fetches high prices on the second-hand market, but thankfully the music to all the films is now available on iTunes. With little merchandise based on the film, we thankfully have some video games. The Last Crusade game arrived in 2 flavours. The first one was published by US Gold. It turned up on every platform available, all the 8-bit microcomputers, Amiga, Atari ST, NES, which was handled by Ubisoft, Game Boy, Game Gear, Master System and Sega Mega Drive. Consisting of 5 levels, the first 2 have the adventures of Indy as a teenager trying to escape from the grave robbers. Surprisingly, the sprite of Indy has him looking like his older self throughout these stages. Apart from the Amiga and Atari ST versions, they go to the effort of having him in his scout outfit. Level 4 has a change of location on some of the computers, with Indy fighting Nazis on the blimp or in the castle where he locates his father. It then jumps straight to the resting place of the Grail. Between levels there are cutscenes to help tell the story, and the graphics vary in detail depending on the power of the hardware. The game didn't receive favourable reviews at the time, but sold well due to the obvious popularity of Indiana Jones, especially on the ZX Spectrum. I played this as a kid on the Commodore 64 and Mega Drive, and found both versions frustrating to play. The game itself can be completed in say 15 minutes or so, but the difficulty is amped up to artificially extend the game. The Master System version is really tough. One hit from someone and you are dead even if they just walk into you. Indy's whip works like a gun, so you can't use it all the time. You have to essentially pick up ammo to be able to use it. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. You are also on a tight time limit, so you also have to locate power-ups to extend the time. Ultimately, it's just another generic platformer, and a pretty lazy attempt at translating the movie. In 1991, Taito got hold of the license and released their version for the NES. The cutscenes between levels are very detailed, and the programmers mix up the gameplay to include a few puzzles that provide some variety to the game, and you can choose what levels to tackle. It also comes with a great soundtrack. There are puzzles to complete, driving segments, and traditional platforming action. The final levels has you working your way across the floor to avoid traps as you spell out the name of God. With the welcome changes to the game and variety of gameplay, it sadly is way too short, but far superior to the Ubisoft release. Still, if I paid like £50 for this back in the day, I would have been furious. Now, the best game based on The Last Crusade is the point-and-click adventure game for the PC, Macintosh, FM Towns, Amiga and Atari ST, developed by Lucasfilm Games. This version follows the movie's plot closely as you solve puzzles and speak to people for clues as you work your way through the locations to complete the journey to find your father and the Grail. You have to make sure you ask the right questions though, otherwise you'll fail your mission or just get stuck. The game got rave reviews back in the day, with most magazines scoring it just over 90%. Point-and-click adventure games aren't for everyone, as it requires reading lots of text, and it isn't something you can pick up and play for short bursts. I loved this game as a kid, but never got to play it for an extended period of time. My friend had it for his Atari ST, and we only played it for a short while, as we couldn't figure out how to go and see Walter Donovan, so my friend got frustrated and wanted to play something else. I only had a Commodore 64 at the time, so I had no chance of playing it myself. As I mentioned in my review of Raiders of the Lost Ark, there was a game for the Super Nintendo in 1994 titled Indiana Jones Greatest Adventures that combined all three movies into one game. The game has 6 stages dedicated to The Last Crusade, with one level where you control the plane as you escape from the Nazis with some nifty Mode 7 graphics. Playing very much like Super Star Wars Trilogy, it has great graphics and is easy to pick up and play, but can be very difficult, so bear that in mind if you intend to seek it out. Now, before I discuss my final thoughts on The Last Crusade, let's have a quick look at the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which I will review in more detail in the future. Now, I never imagined I'd see a 4th movie. There was of course talk about it for years, and even scripts were started but never greenlit, and Spielberg was very much hesitant about doing a 4th. He felt that the trilogy had ended perfectly, as I think most other people did. I'm sure many of us would happily see a new film, but would still agree that The Last Crusade is really where it ended. Harrison Ford really wanted to bring Indy back. He encouraged George Lucas and Steven Spielberg to come back to the series. So 19 years after The Last Crusade, we got another entry in the series. When they released a teaser trailer for the film, everyone got so excited. It was a brilliant trailer, and once you hear the opening notes to the Raiders theme, and you see the shadow of Indy put his hat on, the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. That's the joy of having a great theme tune. Once it was released, however, it left many disappointed. It wasn't as bad as, say, The Phantom Menace, which had a bigger negative reaction, but Indy 4 was just underwhelming and ultimately forgettable. There are some nice moments in it. I like the majority of the first and second act, but when you get to the jungle I really tune out and lose interest. The idea of being a nod to 50s B-movies was definitely the right way to go, but it wound up being a watered down version of what we love about the character. The violence was especially cut down, a bit too much CGI was added, and dealing with interdimensional aliens I felt was a bit misguided. So many great stories have been spun out of the films with video games and books. What George Lucas came up with was just uninspired. The production values are very good, however, with fantastic production design and cinematography. Crystal Skull cost in the region of $185 million, so they ought to be. The first one cost just under $20 million. I think the huge salaries take up most of that cost for the actors, producers and director. I imagine everyone involved knew this was going to be a huge hit no matter its qualities. You get that feeling that everyone involved is just going through the motions and kind of phoning it in. Apart from Harrison Ford, who seems very invested in playing the character again. I personally think they left it way too late to return to Indiana Jones. Harrison was in his mid-60s, he was in great shape for his age, but a bit long in the tooth to be doing all his action scenes and for it to be believable. If this happened in the mid-90s, it would have been perfect. I'm sure many hardcore fans who had waited for nearly 2 decades to see Indiana again on the big screen were left heartbroken. Now there is talk of a 5th movie that is being written at the moment and is planned for a release in 2020. I think they are making this to apologise for the last one. I don't think Harrison was particularly happy with the end results of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and apparently George Lucas is not involved, so hopefully things may work out for the better. We just have to remember to not get our hopes up too much.
Well, what's he gonna do now?
I don't think he plans that far ahead.
Oh! I'd cover my ears if I were you.
When the film was released in the summer of 1989, I was nearly 6 years old, and do recall seeing advertisements for the film. I remember the video games on store shelves in shops such as W.H. Smith's too, but I wasn't aware of who Indiana Jones was. That year it was all about Batman, and I was far too young to even see that at the cinema, which deeply annoyed me. But it wasn't long till I finally got to see Dr. Jones in action. During this time, Temple of Doom was being repeated on TV, and I thought it was awesome. My opinions on this movie have changed over time, but seeing him for the first time as a child, I became a fan like everyone else. It wasn't till a year later that I got to see The Last Crusade. Even when it came out on VHS, you had to be quick to rent it as it would be off the shelves every weekend. Even at a young age, I saw the qualities of The Last Crusade. The story, humour, action and adventure all worked for me. I wound up watching this movie the most. My local rental store didn't have Raiders to rent as it was an older film. It was difficult sometimes in the VHS days. If a film hadn't been re-released on the format, you'd have to go hunt down an old copy. When you're surviving on pocket money, you're not going to put down £15 for a brand new tape. You would rather wait for it to be on TV so you could record it like a cheapskate. Now I have gone on record and said this is my favourite film of the series. I think objectively Raiders of the Lost Ark is probably the best of the series, but subjectively The Last Crusade just tips over for being the best for me. Its combination of humour and fleshing out Indy as a character just made it for a more enjoyable experience. Raiders and Temple of Doom gave us just enough information on him as a person for us to be informed of his desires and what he's out to achieve. We all know he is a good person and above all a teacher who wants to learn and educate others. Indy is not out for personal gain in terms of wealth, but for knowledge, which makes him an honourable person and earns him the respect of the audience. It's also what makes him so endearing. But The Last Crusade went one step further, and we got to see a different side to him. The opening prologue shows us that he is already following in the footsteps of his father, but willing to go one step further in his efforts to preserve treasures of the past. It's great to see Indy at a young age, but the whole sequence is a bit on the nose, with its desire to show all the traits Indy picks up, like using the whip and how he got the hat, the look he adopts after being inspired by the grave robber. We do find out why Indy has a scar on his chin, just like Harrison in real life, which is a nice bit of continuity. The sequence ends with an example of Indy and his father's difficult relationship. Indiana has been a very solitary person. He doesn't hold down relationships and is very much a one-man operation. There isn't any indication that he is depressed or feeling lonely. I just don't think he likes the baggage of a regular life. In The Last Crusade there is an obvious friction between him and his father. He opens up to him when he says they have never had a normal relationship and hardly ever spoke, but in his father's defence he said he wanted to teach Indiana self-reliance. When Indiana is given the opportunity to speak freely with his dad, he doesn't know what to say, so in that instance they are very much alike. They aren't good at showing their emotions and they seem to get on far better when discussing the whereabouts of the Grail. One of the great moments is when Henry believes he has lost his son. He finally opens up and says how much he cares for his son, revealing if he had only a few more minutes to tell him how much he loved him. The beauty of this scene is that there is a nice slice of humour thrown in, as Indy pops up behind them to wonder what they are looking at. Henry shows his true colours only for a brief moment, then forgets everything and moves on with the mission. With the running joke of Henry's diminutively calling Indy Jr., he finally shows his son the respect he craves when he is reaching for the Grail. Henry just says Indiana to get his attention and tells him to let it go. In this one moment, Indiana desires the Grail for himself, but is shown the way by his father, who discovers what he values most above all, and that's his son. This is of course a nice allegory for our two main characters. In his search for a cup that would bring him eternal life, Henry Jones finds that real immortality has been there all along in his progeny. In having to let the Grail and therefore the power of immortality go, Indy learns that he can't control everything, and that bringing home the prize isn't what will make his father respect him. The whole relationship and what it's been building up to with this one scene makes The Last Crusade the strongest of the series with its characters and emotional core. It really makes you care for Indy and his father. You want them to repair their difficult relationship. It's two stubborn men who struggle to speak their mind when it comes to their emotions, and it's through the hunt for the Grail that they discover what's more important to them. I thought the quest for the Holy Grail was a great direction. Tied to the King Arthur legend through the Templar Knights, it is a story that everyone is familiar with. It is also a story that is wrapped in mythology and rumour, as Indy himself early on dismisses these as bedtime stories. He makes a distinction between searching for fact and searching for the truth. Fact is concrete and non-negotiable, the basis of archaeology, whilst truth is more about belief. Now, even though the distinction may get a little lost along the way, it at least doesn't fall into the realm of conspiracy like in the fourth film, where the factual existence of crystal skulls is bypassed for pure fantasy. If you love the Indiana Jones movies for their action, then you may be disappointed with the amount in The Last Crusade. Spielberg was obviously aware of that and threw in an extra sequence at the last minute, but it's still a bit light overall. Indy doesn't really use his whip or his pistol that much. It certainly doesn't reduce the level of violence like the Kingdom of Crystal Skull, however. Indy still gets armed and shoots the bad guys. It shifts to a more character-driven piece, which in fact benefits it greatly. If the main story of father and son was poorly written, no amount of extra action would have saved it. It's finding that balance to offer enough action but also provide us with an interesting story that we care about. Steven Spielberg is an absolute pro when it comes to that. He never puts the action first and forgets about the story. As Spielberg was unhappy with the Temple of Doom, he wanted to return to the spirit of Raiders, and he may have gone a tad too far perhaps, because The Last Crusade does draw quite a few comparisons to that film, dealing with another religious artifact, the enemies being the Nazis, the return of Salah, and a similar battle in the desert. I don't find this to be a problem at all, but it was something that was highlighted when it came out, and it's pretty obvious. Heck, Return of the Jedi repeats the ending of Star Wars and got away with it. It is the traditional blueprint for sequels. Give them something familiar, add something new, but don't go too far or you lose your audience. The Last Crusade is certainly a more polished movie when it comes to Raiders, which has a more of a handmade feel to it. Raiders is a tad more gritty and dirty, which reflects its love for the old serials of the past. Crusade does continue that method, but its more lavish locations and ambitious script really call for a larger budget, and maybe to the hardcore fans some of the magic may have been lost. It was rare for a third movie in a series to be as good as the first or even surpass it. As Spielberg said, the way Crusade ends with having Indy ride off into the sunset was closing the curtain on the series and that decade. It was now time to move on to other films, and it was his way of maturing as a filmmaker. Raiders was made when Spielberg was young and out to prove that he could make a movie with a tight budget and still get it released on time, giving the studios faith in his ability to deliver. His movie 1941 was a costly bomb at the box office, and the industry cast doubt over him and his credibility. He proved them wrong, and Raiders was a monster hit with critics and audiences. The Last Crusade demonstrated his maturity, but still retained a slice of his youth, with its wonderfully executed action sequences and an abundant sense of fun. Temple of Doom didn't really progress this series as it was set before the events of Raiders, so there wasn't this sense of moving forward. The Last Crusade is a perfect follow-up to Raiders, and we got more of an insight into Indiana Jones and his world. It showed us that he felt unloved by his father, and that the quest for the Grail was a burden on their relationship. But despite those frictions, his mission wasn't to find an artifact this time, but to save his father, and ultimately their relationship. There was more to Indiana Jones than just preserving history.
I never expected to see you again.
I'm like a bad penny. I always turn.
Step back now, Dr. Schneider. Give Dr. Jones some room. He's going to recover the Grail for us. Impossible? What do you say, Jones? Ready to go down in history? The Grail is mine, and you're going to get it for me.
When we get to Alexandretta, we will face 3 challenges. First, the breath of God. Only the penitent man will pass. Second, the Word of God. Only in the footsteps of God will he proceed. Third, the path of God. Only in the leap from the lion's head will he prove his worth.
does that mean? I don't know.
Dad. Dad.
No!
Get back! You can't save him when you're dead. The healing power of the Grail is the only thing that can save your father now. It's time to ask yourself what you believe.
You chose poorly.
Give me your hand! Give me your other hand! I can almost reach it, Dad.
Indiana, let it go.
If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to gain early access to my retrospective reviews, episodes of Fix It in Post and commentary podcasts, you can pledge to my Patreon. Thank you.